Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan, and welcome to this discussion with our CEO, Chris Hurst, on the VMware licensing changes that Broadcom has made. Chris, do you want to give a quick introduction to yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Trevor. I'm Chris Hurst. I'm CEO here at Stratascript. Longtime engineering background, transition over into product leadership and engineering leadership. Excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So first of all, let's discuss the what. What exactly is changing with respect to VMware licensing due to this Broadcom acquisition?
Right, so this is all pretty new, but what we know as an AWS partner based off of what's been sent out from AWS internally is that the AWS hosted VMware on AWS solution, which AWS actually presented to customers as their own solution that they work with VMware, and VMware was effectively just a supplier for the licensing of, is no longer going to be offered or sold for any new licenses, new clusters, as effective immediately. So this is going to mean that AWS is no longer growing that. It will be end-of-lifing that service for customers moving forward.
Great. So what does this mean for any customers on AWS who are currently leveraging the VMware Cloud on AWS solution? Do they need to migrate away from that? Is it going to be supported for the foreseeable future?
AWS has a great track record of supporting things as long as customers are using them. However, they do more soft approaches to help motivate people to move off of it. And so you're seeing this with some of the information coming out on the partner side, with becoming increasingly public, where AWS is talking about specific initiatives to help fund and support customers on the migration off of the service, because they obviously are wanting to cut down support for the service long term since it's no longer going to be supported. However, they want to make sure that customers are not put into a bad position. And so they'll be working on initiatives to help partners, specifically AWS partners, come in and move their customers over to another solution which fits their needs.
Great. So let's drill into that a little bit. What initiatives has AWS presented to the marketplace to aid in migrating away from VMware Cloud?
This is all pretty new, so there's a lot of extra details coming out. Effectively, what they're offering is per VM migration subsidies for a specific number of migrations, where they're offering credits for each migrated VM, even if it's already operating on AWS. This is a little bit different. If you are familiar with AWS's funding strategies, you may be familiar with MAP funding, for example, probably their most popular and heavily utilized funding mechanism and not the most substantial. However, it does not apply to AWS revenue, which is what this would normally qualify as. So having any funding initiative which is effectively based on modernization or migrating from a existing AWS revenue stream to a net new AWS revenue stream, especially when this is most likely, by going cloud native, going to result in a pretty significant reduction in overall customer cost and gross revenue spend with AWS. It's very strange to see this, and it's definitely something where they're putting their best foot forward for the customer to make sure that this is meeting their needs and isn't being seen as AWS abandoning their customer.
So another question to kind of build on this is, any customers who have migrated to VMware Cloud on AWS have obviously done that for a strategic reason, whether that's to reduce management overhead, kind of offload some of that to AWS, or perhaps for cost reasons in the past based on what they could negotiate with AWS. But what does this mean for these customers who have strategically chosen this platform? Are they going to have to make any sacrifices in certain types of functionality or support when they move away from VMware Cloud on AWS?
Right. So there's a few different reasons why a customer would want to use VMware on AWS. The most popular that we see is that they need to operate some on-premise workloads, and they want to have a single control plane. They don't want to have to learn an entirely new operational model to operate it. You see this with large customers who still have large on-premise locations, or may have some specific requirements around latency. Maybe they operate it very close to machinery, or around security where they have to operate some of it within a very specific physical boundary or facility. So that's probably the most common use case. Another one would be that they were in a very big hurry to move. They were already on VMware on-premise and they were able to move much more quickly. That's obviously a lot easier to solve for because we're talking about taking someone who doesn't care and they care as much about the solution and they just want to move fast and offering them subsidy, that's probably not going to be where most of the conflict or difficulty is. Most of this is going to revolve around people who are operating on-premise environments in VMware and wanted to have a single control plane, because they're going to be forced to either operate multiple control planes, A, B, move their operating model. So if you were to go 100% AWS, for example, that might look like AWS plus Outposts, so you can operate some on-premise or some Snow family devices depending on what that on-premise need is. You're also going to have options like OpenShift on AWS, some other operating model which can operate both VMs and containers, or the final option would be for them to actually operate VMware on AWS using VMware Marketplace, which we saw Broadcom release a publication about the capability to do that to customers. However, what they're going to see with that is that they're going to see those significant price increases that AWS was not willing to pass on to them, which they're already experiencing with their on-premise. And from what we've run into with a lot of customers, this is not so much of a, do we want to get off of VMware, so much as VMware is now the new Oracle and we're trapped for now, but we are putting together a plan. We see what this is looking at for cost, and we understand the impact of the model. And we also see how much they're cutting support and cutting other services on the VMware side, cutting costs, and what this is going to do to the product in the long term.
Great. So to wrap things up, what would you recommend? What kind of action would you take to, or advise customers to take in order to mitigate these licensing cost increases and structural changes that are being made to VMware Cloud on AWS?
Yeah, I would really recommend working with a partner who can help, assess that situation. And what that partner should be looking at first is understanding the use case. Hey, what is really needed? Do we really need to have these on-premise workloads? What are the real constraints, the requirements there? And then put together a plan, in this case, quite rapidly, to get you to a better state, whether that is 100% cloud native or moving your operating model to a completely new model, something like OpenShift, or if you want to do a kind of split operating model where you have some things running cloud native, some things running inside of VMware on-premise, but effectively put together that plan and a strategy for that, and then move towards that direction. What my experience tells me is that a lot of times existing environments that were deemed needing to be on-premise, there's a good chance that they don't need to be on-premise anymore, or the operating realities around things like internet connectivity have overall bandwidth have changed those needs significantly. So a lot of those will actually be able to move up to 100% cloud native. It's typically our recommendation because it's going to be the lightest operating lift. And so as you see more and more resource constraint on people who are talented enough to actually operate these environments at a really high level and operate them effectively, you're going to see more and more of a migration to cloud. So being cloud native already, having a very, very small footprint operationally is really beneficial to the business. If you do have to operate some things on premise, I think other solutions, like we've mentioned OpenShift multiple times, are probably going to see an uptick in interest and looking for partners who know that domain really well. So, hey, what does OpenShift on AWS look like? What does an operating model for on-premise look like? How can we take these two things and create a new singular operating model? And hey, while we're at it, you should really be talking to your partner about how do we modernize some of these services, because VMware was great for the VMs, and that was their original need. They had built some additional things with Tanzu for container support. One benefit you can have in this new operating model that you should really be focusing on is, what are some new things that I can do and modernize with my services and make that part of the new operating model, which will be easier with something that was designed containers first. I keep talking about OpenShift simply because it's widely supported. Customers that are used to VMware, large federal government contracts, et cetera, you're going to be able to get similar levels of support and a similar experience from Red Hat. They know how to operate in that space. It is container forward, so ultimately it's operating Kubernetes under the hood, and it still does support VMs. So when you have these legacy workloads, you have things typically that are going to be off-the-shelf software and may not be able to be containerized. So it's still able to fit those needs really well while still being a container forward solution.
Great. Now, finally, I know I said finally earlier, but finally, if there were a need for on-premises hardware, what does AWS offer, if anything, in order to run workloads out at the edge, on-premises data centers, or just individual devices at the edge? Do they have anything that can handle that?
Right. Yeah, AWS has a really broad set of functionality and services going all the way from the traditional cloud data centers that you're used to in the actual regions to local zones, which are still completely hosted and managed by AWS hardware and AWS facilities that are located even closer. So that negates some of the latency or bandwidth concerns in some cases, all the way down through actual operating physical on-premise hardware. That kind of physical on-premise hardware, you're going to be looking at the Outposts line or the Snow family, typically. So if you're looking for something that's at data center scale, so think racks of equipment, you're really looking at Outposts. Outposts is going to be that same operational control plane, can still manage everything through infrastructure code, still manage it through the AWS console, but it will manage that infrastructure down on your premise and your data will not leave the premise. The Snow family, similar concept. It's a little bit more restrictive on what it's actually going to be operating, and it's not going to be as redundant. So this is if you have a small footprint, maybe it's at a specific location, you need to have something that's there that has a whole bunch of storage and a small amount of compute, but you're not talking about racks of equipment. It's really where the Snow family is meant to play, and it's going to be able to be controlled, managed, life-cycled. It's all going to be paid for through AWS console. So it manages that simple control plane layer, just like you would have with Outposts, but it's at a much smaller scale, so you're not buying racks of equipment.
Great. And I think one other service as well. So we've got Outposts, we've got local zones, we've got the Snow family, but then there's also the IoT Greengrass solution, which I believe kind of allows you to deploy services out at the edge. It doesn't necessarily have to be an entire rack or data center type of situation, but for smaller scale workloads, IoT Greengrass may be something worth looking into.
That's a great call out. And where we've helped customers with IoT Greengrass has been typically working with something like, hey, we have manufacturing control systems that we need to be operating with and talking to directly, and we need something local there. We're going to tie that to some larger event bus and overall application that we're going to host in the cloud. And that really lets you lighten that footprint. So if you have some space inside of your manufacturing facility where you currently have a whole bunch of servers and you're tired of maintaining that and you want to minimize the footprint, there are known approaches to be able to go move that up to AWS, take advantage of having it inside of an actual regional data center, and then have the local on-premise processing done by something very light, small, typically ARM-based, and that's where that IoT Greengrass solution you mentioned comes in. It's really great for those use cases.
Great. Well, hopefully we can help our customers to move off of the VMware Cloud solution. So if you're interested, please feel free to head out to our website at stratusgrid.com. There's a button in the top right corner you can hit that says Let's Talk. That'll go directly to our sales team, and somebody would be happy to reach out and talk to you more about your needs. Thanks, Chris, for joining us on this video.
Thanks, Sherman. Have a good day.